and tapping is not what I recommend. And if you don't know me, my name's Anita Bentata, and I've been working in the field of psychotherapy, counselling, psychology and trauma for 29 years. I stopped doing therapy in 2019 and I teach my course. And so I was trained in advanced versions of EMDR and tapping, and this is my short video to answer questions about why I don't do that anymore. So I'm going to check every now and then to my notes to make sure I cover what I wanted to cover. When we study neuroscience, the way the brain works in healthy development and what happens through trauma and overwhelm, then it becomes really clear what to use and what not to use. And it's not, I'm not saying, it's personal opinion what you want to use, but for me, my value and my priority is on feeling free from the past, not digging into the past. My value and priority is on what's quickest and most uplifting, and doesn't take me away from me developing my sense of self and my connections to the world or to others. And from my personal experience of having a childhood with a lot of significant trauma, multiple traumas, and trauma as a young adult in domestic violence, and then trauma going through the court to try and protect me and my children, along with other traumas of being disowned and losing a sibling at a young age suddenly. I've had lots of personal experience with trauma, as well as my work as a psychotherapist, where I've also taught a lot of practitioners, supervised a lot of practitioners, had a lot of practitioners as clients, including numerous psychologists and also psychiatrists, and they didn't know what I was teaching them. I also became known around the world for my work with trauma, and so have regularly received messages on social media from people asking my advice on their therapy process because they believed they were being re-traumatized. And when I talked to people in trauma, when I interviewed people for my program in 2020, I can't remember the exact number, but about 95 or 98% of the 80 plus women that did my program in early 2020 all said that they were still living with trauma and they'd been in therapy. All of that number of women had been in therapy before, that 95 or 98% of them, and they were still suffering significantly, and that's why they were booking in to do my program. So coming back to when you know the way the brain works, you know that when you talk about a trauma, the brain doesn't differentiate between you talking about it and the lived experience of it, and it deepens and lights up those same neural pathways. Now, I use this metaphor a bit because it makes sense to me, the metaphor of when you learn to drive a car, or when you learn to walk, or when you learn to talk. We're not getting in the car and talking about crashing. We're getting in the car and we're practicing what we want to be doing when we get our license. When we're learning to walk and talk, we're doing what is the foundation of what we want to be doing in the end result. And so when we're talking about therapy, most people, including with tapping and EMDR, there is a focus, and I'll go into more detail specifically about each one because there is a difference. There is a focus on the problem. And so the brain will loop back to what it's done most recently and most frequently. It doesn't like empty spaces. It's not going to go to something that isn't there. So unless you pave the way, it doesn't have something to go to, so it'll keep looping back to the problem. And so that for me is the major issue with tapping. Even though there's a nice premise in it of accepting the way we are, it's a much slower way than my method, the essential method, to progress, because it gives you perhaps some peace about accepting yourself, but it doesn't take you to, like when you walk and when you drive, you're looking ahead to where you next want to arrive. And when we look at the tapping process, we're still talking about the problem, even though we're saying we accept ourselves. So it's still, because the brain's very associational, it's still revolving around the problem. It's not unhooking from the problem. It's not progressing from the problem. There's an acceptance within the problem, but it doesn't take us beyond it. And so from my personal experience of using tapping, because I used it in my own trauma journey, I used it between therapy sessions, it's a much slower way because it doesn't help us do the three things that my method does. It does partially soothe us from where we are, but because it's still located in context to the trauma, it's not fully uplifting or alleviating, because we're still connecting and associating, and so the neural pathways are still contextualizing back to what we want to move from. And so it's at odds with what our goals and intentions really are. So the three things that I was saying that needs to happen is it needs to soothe us, but not associate back to the problem, because that just deepens the connection to the problem. It needs to soothe us and then unhook us without denying or minimizing what's happened. And then the unhooking needs to be connected to progressing and moving on in a way that's not connected, that deepens our sense of self, that deepens our connection to the power within us and the power of life energy in the world. And so that's the three things that I teach within my method, and how to trust that. But coming back to tapping, so I hope that makes sense. And if you've got questions, please feel free to message me. My profile will show how to contact me. And getting on to EMDR. Now, EMDR to me is dependent on the skills of the therapist, and a lot of research has been done that the primary significant indicator of success in therapy is not the modality, it's the practitioner, the connection, the relationship with the practitioner. And there's varying levels of skill and understanding with EMDR. So to me, it's not a blanket yes for EMDR. One, because I would only use it in certain situations that I'm going to explain, but the majority of the times I wouldn't be using it, for the same reason as the tapping is it keeps being revolved around the trauma and doesn't teach us how to soothe and uplift without connecting to the trauma, and how to do that without minimizing or denying the trauma, and how to unhook from it and how to move on from it. So I only would use EMDR on an acute incident that's happened. So acute is not chronic, it's not an ongoing incident, it's a one-off incident. So when someone came to me and they were starting to have a trauma response because their sibling had been in a car accident and they'd attended the car accident, and they were having trauma responses every time they got in the car and they heard sirens and things. So we did a one-off session for that. I've done a one-off trauma session for people with severe trauma, and that had chronic trauma, childhood trauma as well, significant adult and childhood trauma. And I've done a one session on using it for an acute incident. and then taught them how to use their mind-body system to be able to progress, because it's much slower if you're using it for chronic events. I've assisted a young child with an acute incident that was a one-off event, and that's all that's needed. But I would say it's that one-off work with the EMDR is far more effective when you teach it the essential method, because then your system has something more to move to. I do know with the way EMDR works is it does help the brain continue and progress the neural pathways on from the overwhelm and shock of where it got interrupted. So there is a progression within EMDR, but my experience is, because of people often have more than one trauma in their background, and their parents and society aren't modelling how to respond to our memories, our thoughts, our feelings, that people often get stuck. I think I haven't really found someone that has, had life experience where they are resourced adequately on how to be with shock or overwhelm or internal conflict and trauma. So, for me, my experience over my lifetime personally, as well as my professional life of this work over 29 years, is that even though EMDR for acute incidents is helpful, it's far more effective and powerful when it's combined with the essential method, so that the system knows how to trust and believe the moving on process, because the brain goes to what it's done most recently and most frequently. So if you keep on what I have found over decades of working is that when I would help people shift the trauma, their body would indicate that it was shifted, but their mind found it hard to believe that it could shift that quickly. So in the essential method, I help people to trust the shift that can happen very quickly in the body, in the energy system, in the feelings. We can shift states very quickly in all those three ways, but our mind often lags behind and finds it hard to trust and believe. So in the essential method, I teach people how to trust and believe, and how to sow more seeds into that. A bit like one of the other the metaphors I use is of a farmer. When the farmer plants the seeds, he doesn't see something straight away, and he doesn't freak out and go, nothing's working. He expects that a good enough amount is going to work, and he sets things in place to have people to pick, harvest, purchase and sell his products. So it's like that's what we need to be able to do to soothe ourselves, to know that when we've created that progression in our system through the essential method, through a one-off EMDR session for an acute incident, we know how to do the progression. We know we need more skills than just an EMDR session. That's, from my perspective, handing it over to someone else. But even if we get taught how to do the EMDR at home, I find people get habituated with thinking from a left brain way that they need to keep doing that processing. But the system keeps looping back to needing to process because we don't have the support and the skills on how to progress. And so our mind just keeps looping back to we need to process as opposed to progress. Keep coming back to how we learn to drive, how we learn to walk, how we learn to talk. If we keep talking about the problem, we don't progress. It's much more complicated and creates unnecessary layers to unhook from. So let me just check my notes. There's things for chronic trauma that EMDR helps unhook and create a progression from, but I find it's much slower and more time consuming than the essential method, because as well as doing the three things I mentioned earlier, soothing the residual of what we're left with without denying or minimizing what's happened, unhooking from what's happened and progressing and moving on, and with a sense of trust and belief. We need to do three things, whether it's for acute or chronic trauma. We need to build a new momentum, a generative momentum that's not associated with the past, because the brain's very associational. So if you keep contextualizing back to the problem, it will keep that door open. You'll keep getting pulled back into that room of the psyche. So we need to be able to create a new momentum. We need to create a genuine, where there's no internal conflict, sense of identity, sense of self that's not connected to the past or the problem, that our system in the cells of our being genuinely connects to. And I've found, I did advanced forms of EMDR and tapping for many, many years with myself and my clients. And I find it's a much slower, less effective. It's got more gaps because their techniques. And so what I teach is specifically the way we were born, the way the mind-body system works, and how to work with that through the day. So you don't have to actually stop what you're doing, but you respond differently to how you are. And so there's shifting, creating a new momentum, supporting our system to be with an identity beyond the old identity that's associated with the trauma, in a way that doesn't split our system, that our system has a knowing and an ease and a solidness of belief about, and as well as that identity and trust in ourself and our intuition and our instinct and our inner being, also having that trust and connection to life energy in the world, so that we revolve around being generative rather than what other people are saying. The other thing that I prefer about my method as opposed to EMDR or tapping is that it helps build our sense of self, so that we're not relying one on a technique or on someone else to fix things, so that we learn how to do it for ourselves, so we don't ever need therapy or to go see an expert again. If we keep doing what I teach, then your system knows how to trust, how to build, how to move on, how to unhook. So I hope that answers the why I don't use tapping and EMDR. It's not necessary. I would only use EMDR when the system is so blocked by images and thoughts that the person cannot function. When it's at lower levels, even when it's impactful, there is a gentler, easier, more way that allows more progression into moving forward, less complicated and less habits that you don't have to go back to correct, because you've been putting the oxygen into the fire that you don't want to build. So if you're interested to know more about the essential method, it is 12 modules, and I run it over 12 weeks over 6 full days. So once a fortnight we meet from 9:30 till 5:30, either in person in Melbourne or regional Victoria, or online. And we do 2 modules at a time, and then you have 2 weeks to integrate it, and then we meet again. So if you're interested to receive information about the essential method, please contact me and I can email you some information, or we can have a conversation so I can answer your questions. The next group is starting again very, very soon. Now I'm trying to work out how to turn this off. I haven't done a live on YouTube for a while, and I can't see an end. I'll try this, hopefully it will work. Nothing's working. This is so funny.